Welcome, everybody. This is Tim Jedrek. You are listening to the Aviation Business Podcast. We have a special guest today. Today we have Brandon Williams. Like I always do, I don't really want to give an introduction because I always like to have our featured guests talk a little bit about ourselves. Some housekeeping stuff before we move on. It looks like we have about 7-8 people already in the room here that's listening. So, obviously this is just a conversation between me and Brandon, but if we always love engagement. We always love it when our listeners kind of engage with our speakers and myself. So there is on the very right, there's a chat bot, or not chat bot. There's a chat button. And if you click this button, you can message your questions towards that thing, and we'll see that. And when if we have time, we'll try to address as many questions as possible. And also, if you have the courage and the gusto, you can also hit a button in the bottom of the screen. You can turn your camera on. You can speak directly to me and Brandon anytime. So, without further ado, let's start the podcast. We want to welcome Brandon Williams to the podcast. Woo! Awesome. I need some better sound effects for this thing.
There you go. No, that works, man.
we got a what do you call it? Party emoji there.
There you go. I like it. Well, Tim, hey, thanks for having me on, man. I do appreciate it. Thanks for bringing me on to be on the podcast. We were talking earlier. I love doing podcasts and as part of the speaking thing. Obviously, this is just a great other format that I love doing. So I appreciate you having me on. Did you want me to go into myself or talk about some things, or what do you want to do?
Let's do a brief intro. So I know a little bit about you. You have a website and all this stuff. Let's just talk. And obviously, we're pilots. We're talking about aviation here. So let's talk about your aviation journey.
And the first question I asked is, would you want me to talk about myself?
You want to talk about myself or my journey, right? How do you know if you're in the presence of a pilot?
Just building the stereotypes, right?
Yeah, tell us how you got involved with aviation and how it led to your career, and then eventually what you do now.
Absolutely, man.
Day zero.
You bet, Tim. So I actually grew up here in where I'm at right now, which is in the Atlanta area. I grew up here. Both my parents retired from a major airline. They weren't pilots or anything. They both just had normal corporate job. Well, my dad was in maintenance, and my mom was in the corporate side. And but I grew up around it. I think that's probably where I first got the the bug. For as long as I can remember, all I've ever wanted to do since I was a kid was be a pilot. That's all I've ever wanted to do as a job. And I'm purely part of the Top Gun generation. I saw the original when I was, I think, in third grade in the movie theater, and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what I want to do. And so that I think it was set since then. So graduated from high school, went to the United States Air Force Academy out in Colorado. Graduated from there, went to Air Force pilot training. Flew the F-15E Strike Eagle for a couple assignments, and also flew the T-38 where I was an instructor, both active duty and reserves doing that. Left active duty, like I said, flew in the reserves for a couple years, and then soon after that started at a major airline. When I left the reserves as well, left active duty a couple years after that, started a major airline, moved to here to the Atlanta area, stayed in the reserves, non-flying most of that. And then about the same time, I got into doing a lot of leadership speaking. Never thought I was going to be doing that. But I fell in with a group that kind of was already doing that. I just kind of fell into it, to be honest with you, is the best way to describe it. And I just ended up loving it and loved doing that. So started my own business, and I started focusing on the human factor safety side of leadership with a lot of what we call high reliability organizations. So, healthcare, oil and gas, energy, transportation, shipping, all those culture organizations, industries actually look to aviation on how we do things that they incorporate. So I was doing a lot of speaking there around the country. And, naturally just kind of a few years ago, just started looking, I started looking at some flight schools and talking to people and looking at the civil aviation side of things more. Most of my time was obviously military, but the more I was learning about it, the more I was getting a lot of interest in. They're like, hey, how do you, bring this fighter pilot debrief you talk about to, the civilian world? Like, how would you do that in a flight school? How do we do these kind of things, or how you guys brief and how you instruct? So that kind of started evolving, and I built essentially a program in a workshop and a model that I take to flight schools, and that centers around really the debriefing, how you do that, the art of the debrief, if you will. And then also the briefing side of it as well, because as we know, the real learning happens, on the ground in the debrief. We can do a lot of things in the air, but as we know, with zero G, zero speed, airspeed, 0 foot altitude on the ground, that's where the learning really happens. So it's so critical because I think in the military, when we would do all our upgrades, whether it's flight lead or instructor or whatever, there's kind of three components to that, right? It was the brief, the execution, and the debrief, and all those are highly looked at and debrief themselves on how you do that when you're upgrading. And so I said, why don't we take that rigor of how to really debrief? Because you really get good at it, right? You get good at doing root cause analysis. You get good at how you talk to the student and how you really pull that out and how you analyze decisions and things like that. So how can I take that that's very scalable, that would work in a very high ops tempo flight school environment? So because one of the common things we always get is, well, we just don't have the time to take this much time to debrief, because you finish one student, you're on to the next, right? There's just barely any time to talk. And so the beauty of it, though, is I've worked in some things where it is very scalable in how you focus your debrief and how you really set that tone in a debrief as an instructor, get the student to talk and how you understand, their execution errors and how you pass that learning on. So that's really where I've gotten to. Like I said, I do a lot of keynotes and workshops with several different organizations, like those ones I was talking about earlier with kind of the safety leadership talks. But the flight schools and working with CFIs has been something I just really, really love, because I mean that's my tribe. That's pilots, and so I can go in and we're already on a level that we can kind of understand each other, and so it just works out really well, and I love doing it. And yeah, but that's who I am, what I do, Tim, in a few minutes there.
Very accomplished career compacted in like 2 minutes. So let's kind of break it apart. So you were in the
Yeah,
military
yeah.
for a bit. You loved aviation. I think I kind of shared something very similar when I was growing up. I'm not a
Hmm.
military pilot. I'm just a general aviation pilot, and we do marketing. But before I got into aviation, I thought the only way in was military, and maybe that's from the '90s and '80s, whatever. Um, that's kind of that was what I thought of it. And then now that I'm
Right.
more exposed to the industry, I realize that anyone can potentially be a pilot if you have the
Yeah.
competency and the commitment to do it.
Hmm.
Um, but so so I had that kind of thing in the military, but I didn't join, and I joined later. But you were in the military, and then later on,
Hmm.
you went to reserve, and then the airline. So I know there's a big
Hmm.
community out there. I don't know if have you heard of RTAG before?
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
help with a lot of I guess they follow this. It's the similar pathway that you had, where they went to the military
Right.
and then they eventually joined maybe the airlines or went into the civilian sector. So maybe can you briefly talk about kind of your experience going from military aviation to like commercial civil aviation, and
Yeah.
how is that transitioning, and then how what are some things that you did to or some tips maybe for people that are going through that right now?
Absolutely. And just to be clear, also my humble beginnings in aviation was, I got my private pilot's license in high school. So, small little country airport, the south side of Atlanta, near where I grew up, and that's where I learned to fly and do that. So I think back on that now, how pretty neat that is, that you get your privates and you're in high school, and then all the other things you get to go do. But you're right. I think I think we sometimes gloss over because of the massive pilot hiring we've had recently, we gloss over just what it does take to go from 0 hours until you are at a major airline. We talk about, oh, you can do this, but as you know, and anybody that does it, especially on the commercial civil aviation side, I mean, it's extremely challenging and it takes a lot of discipline, to do that, to do the self-study, to want to keep going, and you look at how far you've got to go and you have a bad day, and how do you keep going? And as you know, a lot of people don't make it, right? A lot of people don't finish their training for whatever reason. But the ones that do make it, I mean, that's a huge accomplishment. I can't, I don't think we can underplay that, a lot, because there is a lot that goes into that. But to your question, going from military pilot to commercial pilot, not only was I going from military to commercial, but I was going from, flying, small pointy nose airplanes that go fast to much larger airplanes that I had never flown, anything bigger than the Strike Eagle F-15E before. So I was kind of shifting in both worlds, there. I'd say first of all, you know, the major airline I was at, as most, major airlines are now, they just have an outstanding training program, right? They have a really good training program that is designed for experienced pilots as it should be. And so I think that was obviously a big part of it, knowing what to expect. I think a lot of it, just like all pilots, is putting the time in to prepare, whether that be for the, simulator, whether that be for whatever rides coming up, whether that be a test coming up. I think that's critical in any state. And then, just it goes back to old school, chair flying. Just what are you going to be the next day? The V1 cut, or, if you're doing a wind shear maneuver the next day, how does that going to go going over that and thinking about that? Because as we all know, I mean, I'll talk about this in my keynotes, human factors, that's why we do well, right? When we cheer fly, when we think about that, visualize that. So I think all those things we use, from our early days of flying, is going to carry you on forever. And then obviously leaning on, other people that are there that went before me, leaning on those, when I was a new hire first officer, the captain I was paired with was upgrading. He had been at this airline for several years. So, talking with them and going over them and having them, for example, I think about it now like simple things like, my very first sim, we're sitting there and they're like, all right, let's call for pushback. I'm the first officer. I'm like, what do we say? Like just request pushback? Like I've never done this before. It's simple, but I've never done this operation. So that's definitely an area where, those coming from the regional side or other airlines have a much better leg up, is understanding the airline operation for sure. So, but yeah, I think that's the biggest piece of it, is just reaching out, connecting with those that already do the things you already know, and just understand it's going to be, a bit of a learning curve. And as I tell all pilots, always being humble, right? Knowing where your gaps are. And I knew fully I had a lot of gaps because I've never flown big airplanes or worked in an airline before. So, learning that and leaning on people, I think it just goes back to that. And something I always tell instructors when I go to these flight schools, these young CFIs, because a lot of these CFIs, very young in their careers, right? Just starting out, and obviously probably most of them want to advance on up to a major airline, just talking with them. And I always say, hey, I know you're just trying to build hours here and get through this, but realize the things you're doing here, the things you're learning here, the things you're experiencing here out flying with a student, and you're running that show and you're making decisions. All these things are building your tool bag, if you will, for when you one day get to that early, or you're a first officer or even a captain somewhere. So everything you're doing now is building out. And guess what? They're, flying with private pilot students or commercial students or whatever, that's the only place that you're going to take the amount of time you're taking with what we call the basics, right? I mean, just the basic stuff of whether it be, reading a chart or, talking about weather. I mean, yes, you do all that stuff, but as far as learning it and really getting to the nitty gritty of it, that's the last time you're going to be able to do that. So take that time and learn this stuff now to give you good baseline there.
Yeah, I like that. You mentioned, I think it's not even just becoming a pilot or
Hmm.
transitioning to, a different field or whatever it is. I think whenever you have a goal, whether it's entrepreneurial, whether that's becoming a pilot, join maybe the military or Air Force, or maybe even join the airlines or anything it is, whatever your goal is, a big part of it's your network. So
Absolutely,
you
man.
gotta leverage the people, and like, you gotta be able to go
Absolutely.
out there and talk to people. That's kind of what marketing does. We advertise ourselves, we advertise our business, and I think it's so important. And obviously I'm the marketing guy, so I gotta kind of put that little spin on that thing.
100% agree, man. 100% agree.
You mentioned earlier that students, student pilots, people are just getting into the industry. There is kind of a attrition challenge we have with
Hmm.
being a pilot. And I think it's necessary. Like, we don't want everyone to fly if they're not competent, if they're not, skilled, if they can't hold a medical, things like that.
Right.
What are some things that, And I know you're going to get into like, the debrief and all this stuff with this. But what are some things that we can do as maybe instructors or flight school owners? What are some things that we can do in our process to really help the student attrition and retention, and really help get our students to be successful and actually pass their tech rides, become certificated safe pilots? What are some things
Right.
we can do as CFIs and pilot school owners?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, you're correct. The fact is, I mean, everybody is not cut out for to be a pilot, and that's just the way it is. I mean, everybody's not cut out to do a lot of things, right? And we're all gifted with certain things, and sometimes someone thinks you want to do. I mean, you yourself, you talked about you had a massive career change, and we think we want to do one thing, and then realize we're set for something else. So that's okay, and that's part of the process. As far as flight schools, I'd say making it a good experience for students, essentially what you're talking about. First of all, think about how your flight school is set up, right? I mean, so just the basic stuff. So they often say you can tell the culture of an organization like when you walk in the first 5 minutes of how the place looks, how people talk to you, how you're greeted, things like so the simple stuff, right? So I know some flight schools may be struggling with budgets, and we have so much that we can do in this building or wherever we're at, but that's the first thing with what you do have. Make it look good, set that tone, right? Set that tone of whether it's welcoming but professional, right? We want it to be a good time. Obviously, we want people to have fun, but we also want to adhere to, hey, this is what we're doing, and what we do matters, because if you mess up, you can bend metal or hurt people or worse, right? So, setting that tone, I think right away is critical just from the initial you walk in, okay, this place is, they know what they're doing, they got their game on. So I think that's the first easy stuff, that you can do right away. Second is, thinking about things like, when you talk about safety programs, what's required, what's not required, and things like that. But I think I've had a couple of schools reach out to me now, kind of helping them design essentially kind of some safety programs, right? Some basic safety management systems they can use within their schools. And the whole reason for that is like, look, we're trying to obviously we want to have a good flight school, but we also have a solid safety program to really reiterate that so that we reduce mishaps. Obviously we don't reduce human error as much as possible, understanding human factors and things like that. So I think having a solid safety program, whether that just be something as simple, Tim, as just hey, do we have a reporting system where anyone can report something they see all the way down to the, newest student, and something like that. So I think that's another, thing you can get going. And then people see that, number one, so they know you take it seriously and they feel, safe doing it. If someone shows up and, they're not sure about this, they're like, oh, well, this school's got a pretty solid, safety program. Looks like that's a way to go. So I think that's another thing you can do. And then, like you said, you knew I was going to get into the debrief, which I am. But the reason I do that is because that's where the instruction happens, right? And so, if students see instructors that are, we go fly, they talk to you on the way back from the airplane, and then that's it. And it's like, all right, see you later. Um, that's one attitude, right? Versus the instructor that comes back, says, hey, let's talk about this, sit down, go over, go through the root cause analysis, execution, what happened. Here's some things for you to do next time type thing. Again, I know time is a big limiting factor with a lot of that, depending on, the size of school you're at, the kind of operation. I get that. But instructors taking the time they can with students and doing that is probably the biggest piece, because let's face it, if we're a student is, whether it's their money they're investing, they're on some type of, scholarship or, whatever, you name it, or so their company's paying for it, they want to see that what they're doing there, that they're actually spending their time wisely, right? And it's actually working towards their end goal, and they're pulling something out of that. So if you go and sit down at a flight school and they've got a flight debrief checklist or a flight debrief guide right there on the desk, or even a briefing guide right there on the desk for instructional sorties, right away that they take that seriously, right? Right away that they're trying to set their instructors up, and they put a lot of value in that. And I've talked to schools that, they've said, look, since we started focusing more on the debrief, we do see better, phase check results, or we do see better check around results, or we do see better when we go out and do a progress check, or we want to do a, kind of an audit, we are seeing better production out of this. So it does matter. And I think but that is the biggest piece. And it just goes back because that's where the instruction happens. And that's where, again, instilling in your, and if you're running a school, instilling in your CFIs, hey, look, I know that you're building hours. However, this is the why behind what we're doing. Number one, you're building your toolkit, but number two, you're going to see these people again. I know we think aviation's a very big community, but it's really not. It's actually a pretty small group. So chances you see someone else again that you taught or that you flew with is pretty good. So, these are the people who are going to be flying your family around one day, potentially. These are the people that are you're going to fly with and work with. So it's critically important, what we do. And I think reinstilling that is a key part of that.
One of the things you mentioned, and I want to bring it up because when I was doing my training, debrief was very, very important. We did the debrief all the time. But you mentioned something called a debrief checklist. So like I've had my fair share of instructors, and they have different methods of doing the debrief and the briefing and the actual flight. Everyone has their own kind of quirk as far as instructing, and I think I actually enjoy that. Me as a pilot, I've had many instructors, and I take kind of the knowledge of all the C5s I've worked with, and I kind of have my own like kind of hybrid, I guess, melting pot of all these different best tool practices from other
Hmm.
instructors. Obviously,
Yeah.
if I'm going for a rating or something like that, I'm going to go whatever my instructor wants me to do. If he wants me to do this procedure, I'm going to do this procedure, right?
Right.
But I've never seen any school have a checklist for the instructors to debrief. So maybe you can kind of expand on that, because a lot of our audience members are flight schools, and they want to take some golden nuggets away. So what are some things that flight schools can do to create this checklist and then create the system for our CFIs to
Yeah.
train our students?
Well, the good news is, I mean, first of all, you can call it a checklist or a guide. It's the same idea, right? But yeah, the good news is after this, I can provide that to you to put on the show notes or however you want to do it. And I give this to people, give it to them all the time. Just this debrief checklist and briefing guide as well. So, or they can reach out to me and I'm glad to do that as well. So that's the first thing. But yeah, the debrief checklist I developed, I kind of summed it down into four, kind of four parts, right? The first part is what I call setting the tones, which is that kind of psychological safety environment. That goes back to, a whole host of things that you can think about. I mean, and this stuff can be done in a matter of minutes, by the way. I'm just expanding upon it. But setting the tone, that's where, is your student comfortable? Do we just went and flew? Are they not ate? Do they need to get something to eat before we start talking? Do they have time? Do we need to get something to drink? Let's sit down, talk, finding a good spot to do it. And then, kind of open it up and setting that honest tone. And just for example, one of the great techniques I always pass on to instructors, I say, hey, before you even start diving into execution and analysis, find one thing you could have done better as a pilot or instructor that you can fess up to right away, right? One thing like, hey, Tim, we went and flew today. I noticed your landings, you were flaring pretty high today, which resulted in, the results we had. But Tim, I didn't really talk to you much about your landings in the brief. And I think if I would have done that and showed you this technique, it would have been better. So I'm going to take that on me. So the whole purpose of that is just kind of opening up that communication, right? So now the student feels like they can, when it's time for them to talk, they can fess up or they can say what they saw. Because a lot of times we know as instructors, many times it's just hard to get students to even talk in the debrief, right? Just pull things out of them. So set that tone's the first step. Next thing is the execution review. And that's where we really go back to, what were the objectives for this flight? What were we going out to do? What was the standards we were trying to meet? What was the plus or minus airspeed? What were we trying to do here? And did we accomplish that, right? So you can kind of go through each maneuver if you want, or you can kind of hit some highlights if you only have a certain amount of time. And this is purely just to say, here's what we went to do today, and here's what happened. And then from that, Tim, from that execution analysis, what you do, I don't want to say analysis, from that execution review, what you want to do is say you are limited on time. You pull out what I call debrief focus points. And again, this is something we did as fighter pilots. We would go through the execution and then we'd say, okay, so for the meat of our debrief here, here's some debrief focus points we want to look at, 2 or 3 points that we really want to do a deep dive into for the rest of our debrief. Because we could talk for hours about everything, right? So you really want to pull out what are the really most critical items I want to talk to you about, Tim. Your stalls are consistently not great, so let's talk about that. Or, you've got a check ride coming up and you really need to get this down. So I'm going to spend my time talking about this or whatever it is. That's going to be student dependent. That's going to be time dependent. That's going to be instructor dependent, you name it. But the key is having a step for looking at execution and figuring out what your focus points are going to be for that debrief. Then we go into the analysis. Then we go into the really root cause analysis, the real instruction, I call it, right? And when you do the root cause analysis, you're obviously trying to get to that deep level root cause, right? You're trying to get, so if, say, a student was, they were executing a certain maneuver, right? And they didn't quite do the proper steps. Okay. Okay. Instructor may just say, hey, here's the steps. You didn't do this right. Here's how you want to do it. Well, if you didn't really dig and ask, you may not understand that the student actually had heard a radio call and it distracted them and they were looking at something else as they were setting up in the maneuver, right? Because that's a completely different debrief, right? That's a prioritization discussion. Aviate, navigate, communicate, or knock off the mover and answer, or whatever you're going to do. Fly the airplane first. That's a different debrief on how you want to do that. The other thing I always talk about when you talk about analysis is that when we used to, as fighter pilots, something we would do is when we would look at an individual, maneuver execution, we'd break it down to the three parts: perception, decision, execution. Perception, decision, execution.
A new one.
Because
I never heard that. Perception.
well, think about it.
Deci-
So when oftentimes, and we do this as humans all the time in the real world too. I talk about this with business folks. I say, what do we typically look at? We look at execution, which is purely just, stick and rudder and knowledge. Or we want to look at decision, which is airmanship, which goes into the how did you determine this course of action? Why did you elect to not go around here when you should have? So that's the decision part. But we rarely talk about the perception. And perception is really, again, goes back to our situation awareness, goes back to that root cause analysis. So for example, say a student is flying, they're unstable on final, and you want to debrief them on that, and they still land, but it was not very good and all this kind of stuff where they're unstable. And you go back and you talk to them, if you just told them, hey, you're unstable on final, here's what your airspeed control is poor, here's how you want to do it, you were too high, here's instead of doing all that, ask them, hey, on that approach, what were you looking at or what were you thinking? Or, just talk to me through that. Or what was going on here? Or did you hear something else? Were you distracting? Did you understand we were doing this kind of approach? Or, what was going on? And then you may, like, say, for example, again, a student says, well, there was a radio call for traffic and I was looking out, trying to find it and I got high. And okay, again, different debrief, right? Because now they may have known how to fly a stable approach, but they were distracted and misprioritized, right? So then that's a different discussion of, okay, how you divide up your duties, how you prioritize when you're flying and things like that. So that analysis part, that third step, all this I'm talking about is root cause analysis. It's perception, decision, execution, how you break that down. And also it's about understanding the human factors, right? So, maybe there's mental and physical fatigue involved. Maybe it's some complacency. Maybe it's, again, talking about low situational awareness. We talk about channelized attention, all this kind of stuff. That's where you bring that stuff into it as well, right? Say, hey, here was a contributing factor, Tim. I think you were getting a little complacent here because, you've done this so many times and you see what happens. So that's all that stuff goes into the analysis part. And that should be the meat of your debrief, as I call it. And again, you may not have much time for that, but that's the criticality of that second step of those debrief focus points. And then finally, the last part is the learning, the L. This is where you want to wrap it up, put a bow in it, right? So we want to talk about something we're going to work on for next time, or things we're going to work on for next time. You want to talk that, and I always put in that bowl, I say include the student and yourself as an instructor. And what does that reinforce? That reinforce, hey, even as the instructor, even as already a licensed pilot, I'm still learning. I'm still trying to get better. I'm still striving to always get better. And there's no such thing as a perfect flight, right? So I always try to say, bring up something you could have done better as well as a pilot or instructor, just to put that out there. And then finally, we always want to finish on something they did well on, right? Hey, look, I know you're struggling a little bit today with your landings, but hey, look, all your aerial work was phenomenal, right? You made a lot of strides in that. Your stalls are up to par, or whatever. Talk about those gains, because as we debrief, we have to leave ourselves with a high note, right? We have to leave ourselves on a high note. Again, not human factors to kind of keep it coming back there. So that's kind of the four main parts. Like I said, set the tone, execution. What are we going to focus on in the analysis? Then do the analysis with the root cause analysis, that deep level root cause, and then also analyzing our execution with that perception, decision, execution. And then finally, that learning, that lessons learned. What are we going to work on next time? What are we going to pass on? I mean, you could learn some things where like, hey, this is something that the rest of the organization or flight school needs to know about. These are some things we want to pass on up. So that's kind of the four main parts of it. Again, I love to hand this stuff out, so I can give that to you, and or anybody can reach out to me, and I'm glad to pass
Yeah,
that
actually,
on.
let's do that for real quick. So you kind of mentioned that a few times. You have the debrief checklist, and I know we usually reserve this for the end of the show, but if you're listening and you want to get a copy of the debrief checklist, go ahead and I guess check out Brandon Williams' website. So he's on BrandonWilliamsSpeaker.com. It's over here, and then also you can just send him an email too. I think it's Brandon at BrandonWilliamsSpeaker.com. So if you're listening here, whether you're on Spotify or live with us right now, send him an email. Visit his site, check him out. He's a really great guy. Back to the show.
Well, thank you, Tim. I appreciate that.
One of the things you mentioned, this is not has nothing to do with debriefing, but it's more about learning, and it's
Hmm.
more about also let's say as a manager of a company or as the
Hmm.
owner of a company. There are certain ways to talk to your team members to get them to do things, and then everyone has a different leadership style, or everyone has a different teaching style, right? And there's one camp here where it's like, hey, this is what you did wrong. Do this, right? So when you that's probably not the best approach, but that's what probably 80% to 90% of people do. They say, hey, you messed up. Here's the answer. Go and get it. Just do it next time. Now, what you brought up in here, so you had brought up the example of, let's say, an unstable approach, right? So you're
Hmm.
on an unstable approach, and your first reaction or first inclination was, hey, this unstable approach, you need to do this, maybe pull the power, whatever it is, or more flaps. I don't know, whatever. It depends on your approach, right? But what you said actually is the converse of it, which is the better result of it, I think, is like, hey, what are you looking at? You ask the right questions. So it's
Hmm.
not really because what you do by doing this, if you ask the right questions to whether it's a team member, a CFI, a student, it makes them think because you want them
Hmm.
to come up with the answer themselves rather than you
Right.
give them the answer. Because if you give them the
Right.
answer and they don't have any ownership of the answer, they're
Right.
just gonna kind of it's forced into them, right?
Yeah.
So by asking them the right question, they're able to develop their own, conclusions with your guidance, and then they're able to, get the result that they're looking for. So hopefully you get better performance in, the future and all that stuff. So I really do think that the tips that you're providing here about the debrief, about safety, you brought up safety for a bit too, actually, and
Hmm.
let's touch on that for a few minutes as well.
Yeah.
So like a flight school. I think for Part 61 schools, you're not really
Hmm.
required
Correct.
yet to have what's called a SMS, a safety management system. However, I think 141 you are. Maybe I'm mistaken. I'm not entirely sure. But the industry is moving towards implementing what they do in like the Part 121 world and other
Hmm.
places in military as well, which has a safety management system, which includes kind of this anonymous reporting, things like that. Can
Right.
you break down some of the elements to have a really robust safety system at a flight school?
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't mention this in my bio, but the reason I talk about human factors a lot and safety was, one of the other things I did was in the Air Force. I was a aviation safety officer, so I went to the Air Force Safety School. I was qualified to do mishap investigations, and also one of my jobs at one time was at the base I was at was I was the flight safety officer, which meant I managed the flight safety program for that entire base, that entire wing, right? So that was working with other safety reps in the squadrons, how we that reporting system you're talking about, monitoring that and all the different safety programs we did, working with outside, a lot of civil aviation groups that were outside that we shared the airspace with and going to them and, integrating with them. So that has a very near and dear place in my heart because that's where I got a lot of interest for a lot of these things I talk about, especially human factors. And now I teach aviation safety and human factors at several universities around the country as an adjunct. So I do a lot of that as well still in that world. But as far as the main components of that safety program, the first is just having a safety policy, right? So, whatever that is, like you're saying, Part 61, no real requirement. But I've been talking, like I said earlier, I've talked to a couple of schools that are interested in already starting to do that. Even if it's very basic, is having that safety policy, even if it's something as simple as just a few pages of documents or just something that's posted saying, hey, here's our safety program, here's our reporting program, here's where we're going to do it, here's what our goals are with it, or whatever you want to do. So that's just the first part is just having that safety policy. I think a key part of it as well is what we've already talked about is having that reporting program, right? And so whether a reporting program can be, again, something as simple as you have on SharePoint, or it's something as simple as writing on a piece of paper and putting in a box, you name it. I mean, it something where people have an avenue to report, something they see or anything they really see, right? If you go back to the airlines, and if you know anything about the Aviation Safety Action Program, which has been around the airlines for a while now, which has been wildly successful in terms of, uncovering gaps in the system and possible human errors and ways to make it better, which for anybody listening is not sure of that, that's essentially where almost all companies I know adapt to this, but you're flying, you make a minor, say you miss a radio call and they have to call you on guard, or something minor that, switch error, or maybe you bust an altitude or something and you go back. Well, as soon as you get back, and I think it's within 24, 48 hours, you submit this aviation safety action program. Basically say, here's what happened, here's why it happened, here's the human factors involved. And barring obviously, not negligent breaking of the rules or complete negligence on your part, that's something they take back and they're just using it to make the system better. You're probably not going to hear anything back from it, assuming it wasn't anything, like I said, extremely gross or, anything like that. It may require some additional training. You may get a phone call and say, hey, can you tell us more about this? But for the most part, that's been an extremely wildly successful program. But that's just one, on a very smaller scale, though. That's why reporting is so important, because that's really the way you find those gaps in the system. And I think the other main part is you've got to have, management or leadership.
Yeah, like a committee or something like that, or like some type of group
I'm s-
that's kind of
what's that?
like a committee. Yeah, I think it's called like a safety committee where they have like a some type of safety like chairman or safety officer that's in charge of it. Then they do like
Yeah,
audits or
that's
something like
that's
that,
a really good
right?
point when you're talking about reporting. Yeah, that's a phenomenal point. So if you have, for example, with the ASAP program and a lot of airlines, what you have is you have a kind of a gatekeeper committee. So it goes through a committee. First, it's typically ALPA, the pilots union, if that's the union that's with your airline, will have a representative on there. And then you have typically a safety representative from the company that's on there. And then they kind of get all these reports and figure out, they see all of them. And so most all of them are just filed and they say, okay, this is good to know. They put it into a data system. And that's how they track these data metrics, right? They're like, okay, we have a trend of people, being unstable on approach 1,000 feet. Let's go look at this, or something like that. Or we have a trend of on this arrival at this point, for whatever reason, we've had multiple people report they missed the altitude here. Let's talk about this. So that's how they collect all that, or one of the ways they collect all that data. But that's a really good point in how you have a gatekeeper. Obviously, at a smaller operation like a flight school, you could have someone, even if it's you only have a few instructors, you could have just one person. Hey, your job, Tim, is going to be you're going to manage a safety program. You're going to manage the reporting system. Okay. So we want you to track that, come up with a data management. If it's something we need to know about as the owner, then definitely let us know. And then you want to be able to how you transfer those lessons. Okay. So that's another key point of a safety program is how do you promote it, right? How do you actually get the data out? How do you actually, whether it be a newsletter, a weekly instructor, all call, where you're going to get there and say, here's some trend items we're seeing, or even for the students as well. There's got to be ways that you get that out. And then finally, you have to have management or leadership, kind of support for this stuff. And what do I mean by that? You have to have, the instructors, the lead chief instructor, or the owner of the flight school, or whoever that is, see them actually saying, hey, I'm getting this and I appreciate you doing this. And here's what we're doing about this. So people have to see that it actually means something, right? That they're actually making change or they're actually doing something with it. Otherwise, what happens to it? We just get kind of, what's the point of doing
Yeah, it
this? They're not going to do
becomes
anything
kind
with
of
it,
just
right?
this plaque
Yeah.
on the wall where it doesn't really
Exactly.
mean anything
Which is
anymore.
another
Yeah.
thing. I mean, you want to make it simple, right? You don't want to make it hard to fill out. You want to make it simple to do. You want to make it, something that's really easy for people to do and doesn't take a lot of cumbersome time to fill out. So that's another key part of that reporting system. That's kind of the main highlights I like to get out. You have a policy, you got to have a reporting system, a way to transfer those lessons learned, to compile that data, and then you got to have leadership or management support of it, and see people doing it. A good way to do that, this is just basic leadership 101 too, I think, though, is being transparent, right? As an owner, as a leader, when you mess up, fess up. When you mess up, hold yourself accountable. When you mess up, tell people that, and show them that, hey, I was out flying, I did this, and here's why. So that's a key part of it as well, is showing, hey, if I'm the one in charge and I can talk about things I did wrong, and certainly, you as a less experienced pilot or as a student can definitely feel safe to kind of speak up.
Yeah. I think the safety thing it helps build a culture. I think, and
It
part of
really
the thing,
does.
you mentioned earlier, when you walk into a flight school, you kind of see, hey, is it well taken care of? There's no cobwebs in the side. The bathrooms are clean. The way people talk to you are nice. And then having a safety culture, ingrained in that, really just further bolsters your culture for to be successful. And I want to emphasize that because this is outside of aviation, but before I was in marketing and in also in aviation, I used to work in manufacturing. And manufacturing, this is like high speed manufacturing. There's thousands of pieces a minute, you know. So I worked in quality assurance, and I worked very closely with safety. Some of the things that happen in the facility, especially like 500 people facilities I used to
Hmm.
manage for, a lot of sentiment that happened with the ground linemen, people that were on the front lines doing all the work, is that they'd report these issues. Hey, there's a broken ladder here, and the problem is management, which would be me and my team or me and my colleagues. I'd bring it up to management or senior management, like, hey, we got to replace this ladder. Hey, we got to replace this floor or whatever it is. And
Right.
then the delay in response and the delay in action caused sentiment from the team to actually not want to report anymore.
Do it.
So
Yeah.
then even though on paper we had all these procedures written up, all these documents, all the safety plans done. If you actually start interviewing the team members, it wasn't that good. So during audit time, we had to really seal the we had to make it work. But we made it work. But it's just the culture is it's not you can't just do it once a year. It's
Right.
a consistent thing that goes throughout
Absolutely.
the entire business cycle. So
And Tim,
I'm going
was
to
it?
segue into another. Oh, sorry.
No, just real
Please.
quick on that point, since you brought the culture up, it's a really good point because the other thing with a safety program, you're talking about how you implement that is you can't have a you cannot have a trend or even a inclination that this safety program or when you're highlighting items that may be wrong or gaps in the system or errors, it cannot be used as a blame or a retributional type event. Because if you start taking those inputs and then now it's going to be, hey, let me talk to you, Tim. This is what happened the other day. I want to talk to you about this. Like that type mindset, then again, that's going to have the exact same effect you're talking about. Now, having said that, you know, there is definitely, and I do this a lot in the healthcare teams. I see this all the time as well, too. There's a difference between an error and a negligence, right? Or a mistake and negligence. So, it's not a free reign, get out of jail free card for just being, doing
Say
questionable,
do
very
whatever you
highly
want.
questionable decisions, right?
Yeah.
But a valid safety program, that's not the input you're going to get anyway. So, but the key there again is not using it as a punishment or a blame and train tool, I
Yeah.
call it, but a
I think
learning
it's
growth
all about
tool.
continuous improvement. I think we have to make it where whether someone's giving a suggestion, or someone's critiquing somebody. We, for example, right now at Rudder, we meet with our flight schools
Hmm.
regularly. One things we like to do every quarter is ask for feedback, is ask
Yeah,
how we're performing, and we don't take that as a something mean. It's like, hey, if we're messing up, we want to know, that way we can improve.
right,
Same thing for the safety culture. Same thing with improving. Even the debrief. It's all about criticisms. Learning, taking criticisms, and then improving yourself and the company, or whatever we're talking about. It's taking criticisms and then improving yourself.
right.
And that's the challenge to get better. And I think a lot of people lack that. So I want to move on to the next topic that you've brought up multiple times during our recording. You brought up human factors. So human
Hmm.
factors is it has a lot of, I guess, biology nuance to it, on
Hmm.
kind of some cognizant, I guess,
Right.
cognitive nuance to it as well, maybe physiological to it. How does obviously you think about the human factors in aviation when you're doing your training, for example, like oxygen, things like that. But I think when you're addressing it, you might be addressing something a little bit more deeper. Can you kind of talk a little bit about what you refer to when you're talking about your human factors and how that impacts a flight school and also maybe a student?
Absolutely. So you're right. I mean, human factors, my first exposure to it was probably, hearing about human factors engineering a long time ago, right? Which is just the idea of that is the airplanes we fly, these laptops we're using, the cars we drive, the chair I'm sitting in, it all has human factors engineered into it. How's a human going to interact with this thing? I mean, aviation's full of it, right? Why do we have red lights? Why that pop off? Why is the airplane I fly, the gear handle shaped like a wheel on the
It's
end of
shaped
it,
like a
right? I
gear,
mean,
it's a gear. Shaped
yeah.
like a
So I mean,
flap, it's a flap.
right. Why do we have bright yellow lights that flash for master caution near our eye level, when something goes wrong? So, I mean, so you're around it all the time in aviation. We learn, I mean, in aviation embraced it way before, automobile design and did a way better job of that long time ago. So we figured that out. But you're right. Human factors, when I talk about it, is more around the human and the decision making process, right? And how these environments affect us. So, I talk all the time, you just mentioned earlier, when you're talking about leadership, is instead of saying, hey, you did this wrong, here's what you need to do, don't do that again. I call it a blame and train approach, right? Which we've already figured out that, I mean, everybody that shows up, or any professional showing up to work, or any student you're working with, or any instructor that's in your flight school, none of them are showing up saying, hey, I'm going to make a mistake today. Hey, I'm going to do bad today. Hey, I don't want to do my best today. I mean, nobody's doing that. So when we have mistakes, or we have poor execution, or we have results that don't, and this is from flying or non-flying, events. Like, as leaders, we have to understand there are human factors at play, right? Whether it's mental fatigue, physical fatigue, complacency. In aviation, we talk about tunnel vision or channelized attention. We already talked earlier today about prioritization, aviate, navigate, communicate. That's all human factors, right? Why? Because we know the human mind, multitasking is truly a myth. We cannot multitask. We can task switch, but only on a few different things effectively at any one time. So the instrument cross check, right? It's called a cross check. It's not called a, you know, focus on one thing, or whatever you want to call it. So, because we understand that we can't focus on all these things at once. So we have to be very effective at that. So that's what I talk about when I talk about human factors. And that's why I work with so many, high reliability organizations. I call it, similar to aviation, like healthcare, like oil and gas, like, other shipping and transportation companies, nuclear power, because those are similar industries like ours, that they look to us actually for a lot of this stuff, that where error can literally result in, injuries or worse. And so as people, we have to understand that. And if you want to make an organization better, if you want to have a better safety program, if you want to debrief the right way, you have to understand what human factors are at play. For example, Tim, if you show up to go flying as a student, especially, and you only got 2 or 3 hours sleep last night because you weren't feeling well, or because, say, you have a new baby at home, I don't know, something, well, that's going to affect your performance, right? And so, now you don't want to pry, too much into personal stuff, but if you're assigned an instructor to someone, or even you own a flight school and you want to know your CFIs, that's the importance of just having simple questions. Hey, Tim, how's it going today, man? Hey, how you doing? I know your mom was sick. How's she doing? Or I knew that you have a new baby. How are things going? And you're like, well, Brandon, actually, I didn't sleep at all last night. Oh, whoa, let's take you off the schedule. This is not a good idea, or something. So, understanding those human factors, because none of us show up to work and just, drop our baggage off, in our personal life and just go to work. I know as pilots, we're taught to compartmentalize, and we do it really, really well. But when you get down to execution, like I was talking about earlier, perception, decision, execution, no one goes out and intends to have a bad landing. So let's look at that. What were the human factors involved? Was it task saturation? Was it poor communication between crew? Was it, what was it? What was going on there that drove this decision, that drove this error? Okay. So that's what I really talk about when I talk about human factors, is really, how does the environment we're in affect our decision making? And as you know, I mean, majority of flying now is airmanship, right? Our decision making. And so, understanding those factors and understanding what our situational awareness is and how we build that situational awareness, that's a key part of CFIs. That's what you're trying to pass on to your students is, hey, before you even walk out the door, you should already have built your situational awareness, whether it be, understanding the weather, understanding, if we're going to go to this airfield, there's going to be a lot of traffic over there. Here's the gaps that we're going to see. Here's the threats we're going to experience. That's why in my briefing guide, I have a whole section on just, threat error management. What are the threats we're going to see today? Let's talk about those for this particular sortie today. So, that's what I try to work in human factors into everything I do, because really at the end of the day, I mean, to me, that's what it's all about. That if you want to, we're never going to make human error zero, right? But if we want to reduce it and mitigate it, especially in these complex and certain environments at which aviation is, then you have to understand human factors. And by the way, that works whether I'm talking flying or whether you're just managing and leading a flight school from the people side of things, right? Just understanding that and how that works.
Yeah. One of the things you kind of went over is I think the human factors play a part into ADM, which is the aeronautical decision making. And I think for a lot of pilots, we kind of go through the kind of FAA prescribed materials like, hey,
Hmm.
what is it called, macho, whatever, and
Hmm.
negligence. They have certain ways they approach ADM. I'm kind of curious to hear what you think about, let's just put a hypothetical situation out there. Let's say I'm a CFI, I'm with a student. Let's say it's an instrument student, but the weather's not looking great.
Hmm.
I don't know, maybe low ceilings or something. What factors go into making the decision, or the no go decision, I guess, as you can say? Like what should, especially for the newer CFIs out there that might be listening, how far do I push the envelope versus, to get the best performance, and also how far, or how far is that before it's like not a safe event, and how does my human factors and aeronautical decision making play a part in this?
Well, Tim, that's where you as a CFI have to make your money, right? That's why you're trusted to make that decision, right? But I will say, so, I will say with that though, that's why actually in my briefing guide, I have a whole step. You go through, the kind of the I am safe checklist, right? The physiological, are we ready to go? Is everything signed off? Syllabus flow, all this kind of stuff. You go through what the weather is, what our threats are going to be today, what are we looking at? Then before you even go into the mission brief and what we're going to do and some of the instruction, you say, okay, go, no go. We've thought about all this stuff, like you said, low weather day, your experience level, my experience level as an instructor, the kind of airplane we're flying, the things we need to accomplish today, how your flight went last time. Tim, if you came in and said, I don't feel great, but I'm good to fly, or maybe you came in and said, I feel like $1 million, man, I slept great, the coffee's awesome, whatever, like that all is going to go into that go no go decision. So I don't think we can't sit here and make a hypothetical probably because as you know, there's so many variables that go into any one single flight and people. However, I think it's a great point though that you brought it up because like I said, each instructor, you should always have a step in your, even if you're just going out to fly for fun by yourself, there should always be a mental step or checklist of a go no go after you've considered your own physiological needs, after you've considered the external factors. Is there any MEL, maintenance items on the airplane that's written up or things that are going to affect this today? Is it what's my experience level with this kind of stuff? Have I done this recently? What kind of weather are we going to see? Are we going to a busy airport? Are we going to this type of location? Are we dealing with terrain today? Lower ceilings like you talked about, thunderstorms, and we don't have this kind of weather radar or whatever it is. I mean, all those things have to go into your decision process and make that go, no go call. And then even some flight schools, especially the more structured ones, right? What you'll see a lot of times is, you'll do the kind of fill out the risk management, sheets.
Yeah,
And so you
they
can
have
even,
I've seen some have a form where it's like, oh,
yeah,
it's a 3 knot crosswind. Sorry, you can't go up.
and
It's like,
that's a good point, right? Now that on the other side of that, we can only wear so many suspenders and belts until, it's just, if we really want to be safe in flying, let's just not take off and land, right? I mean, if you want to make safety all the way, but we know at some point we're always going to accept some risk. I mean, period dot. We're always accepting risk. It's a matter of, make sure it's low risk and also that we're mitigating that risk, right? So that's the key part of it. But with that ORM or that risk management sheet you're talking about, I think one good thing of that, as long as it's not too cumbersome, again, making it simple, is at least it's a way to force you to think about it, number one, and at least it tries to make it somewhat objective, right? In some schools, what they'll even do is they'll have ranges, right? They'll say, okay, if it's between this numbers, then this requires whether it's an operation supervisor type or a chief pilot or something like that has to sign off before you can go, or you at least need to consult with them before you can go. So that's a good example of having some built-in go no go, gaps in there. And it's just another way to break the chain of events, right? Because we all know aviation mishaps, chain of events line up to make that mishap, right? It's not
yeah,
just
a
one
lot of
thing.
small bad mistakes make the big mistake.
This with
Usually, is
cheese
kind of what
model,
we see.
right? The James
Yeah.
Reason model line up to make an accident. So that's just another way to stop the chain of events. But at the end of the day, that's why you get signed up to be a CFI too. That's why you have that autonomy, and good flight schools will give that autonomy to instructors, obviously up to a certain point, and instructors should be able to know that too, to say, hey, look, I don't know about this one. Maybe I should go talk to the chief about this one, or someone else, and say what we should do here. So,
Yep. I think Sam put a comment on here. I don't know if this is the right one because I've never used it. Called the frat tool, I guess is what it is. I guess that's that's the one where they have a checklist of like, hey, the I'm safe checklist plus the crosswind component plus your experience level. I think some flight schools use this tool. It's some type of checklist or some type of program.
hmm
Yeah, for the audience out there, maybe look that up. I'm not sure if that's what it's called, but
great.
yeah,
Absolutely.
I've seen it at different schools where they have some type of system like that. So, we are going towards the end of the hour here, so really appreciate Brandon coming on the call here. Before we end though, so I'm always we're not going to end right away. If you are listening on here on the live audience, feel free to type in your questions or go on camera, and we'll welcome you in. But as we are ending here, I do want to ask one last question to Brandon, which is like, so I think a lot of things we talked about, human factors, safety management, culture. What's your, I guess, number one advice for people that are, let's do CFIs today.
hmm
There's a lot of new CFIs out there. I think there's a big hiring freeze about 3 years ago, so I know there's a lot of people got into the industry. It's about to come up. I know the airlines have suspended hiring, but a lot of it's going to
hmm
be opening up next year.
Yep.
So we're going to be seeing a lot of new pilots out there. What's the kind of the best advice you can give to someone starting out in their career, and how can they be successful as future leaders in aviation?
Yeah. So, like you said, I think you're focusing on CFIs. So, what I would say is, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier, that what I tell, a lot of these CFIs when I go talk to these schools, or just in general, is I know that a lot of times your focus is, just on building time, because I want to get to the next step, right? I want to get to the next higher level, whether that be corporate flying or flying some bigger, or regionals and onto the airlines, bigger airlines or whatever. And so I say, first of all, remember there's going to be a day when, I know you don't think about it now, there's going to be a day when you're going to be flying that airliner, and you're going to see, that little Cessna sitting over there, but you're like, oh man, I wish I could go back and do that right now. Just one day, I just want to go fly on my, go do some,
I've
more.
heard this so many times, so many times. You're not the first one, honestly.
There's going to be a day when you're going to say, man, I wish I could go jump on that airplane, just go fly around for a little bit. Like, there's going to happen. So realize that. I know it doesn't seem like that. So realize that, first of all. But the second part is what I said earlier. Hey man, use this time now to build your skill set, your tool bag, because again, what you're doing now as a CFI, when you're out making decision with a student, like go no go decision you're talking about earlier, assessing their needs and how you're going to get this training profile accomplished, and how far do you let them go, before you take the airplane, or how far do you let them go to do this so they learn, but at the same time you're keeping it safe. As you're building all this stuff, and you're watching fuel, how much gas do we have to go do this, or do we need to go to this airspace instead, or coordinating so we can do this, and things like that. You're building that experience and that skill set that you are going to use one day, right? So keep on that. Keep doing the basics now, because again, this is the only time, or the last time I should say, that before you go into your next job that's going to be a step up of a CFI, this is one of the last times you're really going to focus on all these basics of aviation, I call it, the basics of approach plates, and charts, and how to use this, and how to, think about these rules that you're just not gonna at that level really focus on and get in the weeds on. So do that now, so you have that good baseline. So when you get in more advanced aircraft, and you're flying in crew aircraft, and you're learning these other systems, you can focus on that, because you're building that skill set. Like you said, you're building that decision making process. In the Air Force, we used to always say, if you want to get better at something, be an instructor and teach it, because that's where you really start to get better at it. So the more you're teaching aviation and flying, believe it or not, the better pilot you're becoming. So I think that's the best piece of advice I can give, is don't lose sight of that, and keep working on those basics while you can.
Yep, we're wishing much success to the next generation of pilots. I know that Brad Rudder has been a big part in helping shape that, helping train the next generation of aviators. So we really appreciate Brandon's kind words to the next generation of pilots. As we conclude this podcast, I want to give some time for Brandon to kind of talk a little bit about his business, about what he is. So I always reserve the last couple of minutes for a call to action. So what's your call to action? What do you want people that are listening to on this podcast to do? Maybe give you a call, or what's going on?
Absolutely, Tim. Yeah. So I know you get my email address up there. So reach out to me on my email address. Go to my website. I'm also big on LinkedIn. So Brandon Williams Speaker, if you want to find me there. But reach out. I have a mission, like I said, to take this debrief model and briefing, the way we did it as fighter pilots in the Air Force, and I've modified that a little bit with those human factors considerations, but really taking that two flight schools, two CFIs. I put on debrief workshops. I do keynotes, and we do planning workshops as well. But really, with the flight schools, the best thing I bring to you, I think, is the debriefs, and that's really how you debrief. Again, extremely scalable, but it's so critical because I think the learning, like I said, really happens in the debrief. And aviation is extremely unique in the fact that I think that I've tried to find other industries, but rarely is it that one day you're a student and you finish your CFI and you're signed off, and then the very next day you're expected to go out and teach all these to a brand new person who's never done that before. So, and we're considered a higher liability industry, right? Where mistakes can literally injure people. And so I just think it's just an extremely unique industry that we do that. And so I think giving our young CFIs all the tools they can, because I mean, let's face it, a lot of these young CFIs, is maybe you're very young in your career, could be your first real job, actually. I mean, outside of, after you've gotten through all your ratings out of school, outside of college, and here you are teaching. And it not just, the rudimentary idea of debriefing, but this is leadership skill sets, right? You talked about earlier. This is communication, how you communicate with people, how you empower them, how you get them to speak up, how you set that tone so that everybody, I mean, because like you said, Tim, you've been outside of aviation, that's hard for just non-pilot people to do, right? I mean, just how you communicate and pull the best out of people. So these kind of concepts, I've built this for a reason and designed it for a reason. So I really encourage you to reach out if you're looking to make, like Tim said, making your flight school better. How can you make the experience better for the student and the instructor? And that really goes back to the instruction, which I think goes back to really the brief and the debrief. So
Yep. Thank you, Brandon, for being an honored guest. Yeah, if you are a flight school owner or part of the industry and you want to have Brandon come to your school, check out his website, BrandonWilliamsSpeaker.com. There's also his email, and also a lot of resources about the debrief we talked about, the safety debrief, and all that stuff. I highly encourage you to go out there and check him out. So we are very let's give our gratitude to Brandon for hopping on here, and we really appreciate it. As we end here, I want to talk about a little bit about Red Rudder Marketing. So this is the Aviation Business Podcast. We are hosted by Red Rudder Marketing. We are a marketing agency that helps flight schools all across the country grow and scale their business and enroll more student pilots. So if you are a flight school owner or aviation business, you're looking to scale up, give us a call. It's 314-804-1200. It's rightruddermarketing.com, and we will see you in the next episode. So see you guys around. Thanks so much for
thank you, Tim.
listening.
Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.